Hello, so my name is Sydney and today I wanted to talk about reading or writing. When I was younger, we had a lot of books in our house, some fiction books, some reference books, comic books, all kinds of stuff. And my parents would read to me going to bed. My favorite book was called Goofy on the Hillside. I talked about this before in my most influential books or books that changed my life video, so I can link that down below. But that was my favorite book, and I always wanted my parents to read that one to me. That, established in me this love of reading, and so I used to read a lot of books from the library or read books at home. I wouldn't say that I read like a lot of books, but I was like always had a book. And I never like really rushed myself or anything to read through it. Like, nowadays with booktube and everything, it can be very pressure inducing to feel like you have to read books quickly and to read like a lot of books and stuff like that. The point is, I always loved reading. When I was in second grade, I actually won first place for second graders in the literature category at this, I don't know what it was like some kind of event that my school used to hold, where basically every student could submit like a creative project. There was different categories like literature and like I don't know what the other categories were, but I won first place for a story about courage. I also, at some point in my elementary school days, worked with my dad on a story called Larry the Leprechaun. So from what I can remember, I said the story out loud and he typed it. And a couple years ago, he actually was like looking through his computer and he found the story. And so what I did was I printed it out and I made it into like a little booklet, and I drew like little pictures for each page, and I gave it to him as a present for Father's Day. And like, it's one of my favorite things I've ever given somebody, because it's like this throwback to my childhood, and this thing that we worked on together. And it was one of the first things I ever wrote. And then one day I picked up a book, which is now quite controversial. I picked up Twilight. And after I read the series, I started to feel like, oh, I could be a writer too. Twilight happened, and that was kind of the first time where I became, like, I guess, more serious about writing. Not even necessarily that I wanted to like publish a book or anything, but just I wanted to do it. I wanted to devote my free time to it. And so I did, and I haven't stopped yet. And that was back in like, no, it had to be the middle of 2008, like that summer. And so it's been like, what, 10 years at this point? Oh my gosh, it's been 10 years. I've been a writer for a decade. I gotta celebrate this somehow. How do you celebrate something like that? Maybe I should buy a typewriter. And then maybe about 3 years ago, I discovered BookTube. And that's when, I was watching all these videos avidly, and, there's so many like good books and interesting books that they were talking about, and then that began my book buying spree. Like, I must have bought like a couple hundred books over the next few months or the next couple of years. And I was just reading like voraciously. I spent all my free time reading. I spent my time writing too, but at that particular point when I discovered BookTube, I wasn't quite feeling the writing as much. And so it became this thing over the next couple of years where at any given point in my free time, I was either writing or reading. If I wasn't feeling writing, then I would read. If I wasn't feeling reading, then I would write, but I was always doing one or the other. In the past, probably 18 months or so, I've written 2 books, and I've revised those 2 books, and I've started a 3rd book. Like, I've done a lot of writing and a lot of revising. Like, I've spent a lot of time looking at my creative writing and my manuscripts and stuff. And I think I spent that much time doing it because I wasn't reading very much, but I still had that foundation of reading in my, in the past, that I was able to draw on in order to write my stories. And I found that every time I picked up a book to read, it made me want to write. Like, seeing this other author's work, like delving into this creative fictional world, it made me want to do the same with my own. Like, I'll read this book, and even sometimes this will happen with movies. Like, I'll interact with these other pieces of creativity, and it'll like inspire me to be creative in my way, which happens to be writing. And then you get ideas from it, like, like, ooh, what if my character did something like this? And you may not even use that idea, but it gets the ball rolling. Like, it makes me feel inspired, and so I get really anxious to get back to my own stories. So it was always kind of this thing that was constantly feeding into itself. And I remember, even before I like started to get like really avidly into reading after discovering BookTube, I remember reading and hearing quite often that if you want to be a writer, you have to be a reader. It was this fact, and I hear it in Stephen King's voice. I see him saying it. And I felt kind of bad because, yeah, I was a reader, but I wasn't exactly an avid reader. But it just kind of made me feel like, how can I be a writer if I don't read that much? And I didn't really like necessarily doubt myself because of that, but I didn't necessarily do anything about it. Like, I continued to read at my own very slow pace. and I continued to write, you know, stumbling through this new writing joy and like finding my way. And of course booktube happened, and at that particular time, like I said, I wasn't much into the writing thing, so it was kind of like, finally I'm an avid reader and I'm not even writing. Then I had my publishing internship, and I don't know if it was the publishing internship where, you know, part of my job was like reading books, or if it was the fact that at that particular time I read A Court of Mist and Fury by Sarah J. Maas, which is one of my favorite books ever. But the book was like so like intense and so good that I felt like nothing else that I read afterward could compare to it. And so that was the beginning of my quote unquote reading slump, as booktubers would say. From that point up until very recently, I read a little bit, but that spark, that joy of reading just kind of fizzled out. I was waiting for that kind of spark to reignite. I don't think that it did until recently. I started this new job, and at my job there's this thing called the bookmobile, which is it's a library on wheels basically. Every couple of weeks, the local library drives around with their bookmobile, and they drive up to where I work, and you know, you can go and you can check out books from the bookmobile. They'll come back in a couple weeks, you can turn them in. And so I got an audiobook, a regular book, and a movie. Just this idea of like interacting with the library like sparked something in me. And then I went to my local library like here where I live and checked out some stuff as well, and like this, it just felt like this love of reading has reignited. I've got new books to read now. So it's been nice. It's been nice. I feel good. I don't feel like I'm pressuring myself to like read a bunch of books or read fast or anything like that. Like, I'm moving at my own pace. I'm reading when I want to read. I listen to the audiobooks on my 40-minute commute. All of that leads me to revisit the question of, do you need to read to be a writer? And I think the answer is yes. However, I don't think you need to necessarily be like a voracious reader. And what I mean by that is, going back to the whole booktube thing, like, booktube is good in a lot of ways, but there is that factor of putting pressure on you to read more than maybe you would otherwise. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it can overwhelm you in a way. It can almost become like a competition of sorts. Like, who read the most books in the year? Like, oh, she read 100 books this year. How did she do that? I need to do that. You know, like, I need to step up my game. And it's not even about that. It's about, you know, spreading this love for stories, and it's about communicating your love with other people who are readers. And so I think my issue with that is that I let it get to me. I let this pressure get to me. But I do think you need to read to be a writer. For one thing, how can you write a book if you've never read one? If you don't read one often enough to know like kind of the, you know, what goes into a book. How do you form a plot? How do you describe characters in a world? Like, how do you create all these elements of a book if you've never written one? How do you know if the apple pie that you made tastes like an apple pie if you've never eaten an apple pie before? You got to try it in order to create it. Then there's the other thing where they say that you have to read widely. You know, so a lot of people might stick to one or two genres, or they might stick to like, you know, one or two types of books instead of like maybe reading, you know, a book from a different genre here and there. Like, I read mostly YA, but every now and then I dip into like an adult book or a middle grade book, or, you know, a contemporary versus my usual fantasy or adventure. And so it's important to get a taste of what else is out there. I'll be the first to admit that I do think I need to diversify my reading a bit, but I'm not going to push myself to do that, because then I'm going to end up in another reading slump and I'm not going to want to read anything. For example, the audiobook that I was listening to is called The Girl You Left Behind by Jojo Moyes, and if you recognize her name, that's because she wrote Me Before You. And the only reason I picked up The Girl You Left Behind was because I recognized the author's name. I had no idea what the book was about, but in listening to the audiobook, I was very aware of the fact that it was not the typical thing I would have reached for. Like, it was very much contemporary. There was not 1 ounce of unrealistic, you know, fantasy, but I still enjoyed it. I write fantasy and adventure, but contemporary, you know, kind of pays more attention to the characters themselves, whereas like fantasy and adventure tend to pay a lot of attention to the world and like the plot and stuff like that. And one thing that I try to do in my writing is that I try to make the characters a big part of the world. Even though there's all these other fantastical things going on, the characters are still important, like, and the decisions that they make are still important. And I think that that's something that I would have never picked up on or decided to do if I hadn't read some contemporary genres. And so it kind of goes back into this thing, like, yes, it is important to read in order to be a writer. Like, there's so many tools that you would never learn if you don't read the books. Because you can't just read one book and then decide to write a book and think that it's going to be good. So I think that that's all I have to say about this topic. Down below, I would love to know what your guys' take is on reading and writing, and whether you need to read to be a writer. Do you need to write to be a reader? No, because I know a lot of readers who don't write. You know, like when I was at my publishing internship, the editor that I was working under, I asked her if she could ever be a writer. And she was like, no, I'm much better at editing stories than writing them. And so I think that's really interesting how, you know, reading made me want to be a writer. But that's not the same for everybody. Some people just want to read. They don't want to write, you know. It's like me. Like, I love to listen to music, but I don't want to be a songwriter. Like, that's just not what I gravitate to. Yeah, so let me know your thoughts down below, you guys, and thank you guys so much for watching. Give this video a like, hit subscribe, hit the little bell notification icon so you can be notified whenever I post new videos, because I've got lots of videos on writing coming your way. I'll see you later. Toodaloo.
By tomorrow we'll be swimming with the fishes. Leave our troubles in the surf.